In this video, we're going to look at illustrating decimal numbers. I love being able to turn a mathematical concept into a picture, especially something like decimals and fractions where it's kind of abstract. So when we think about decimals, remember it's saying it's less than a whole. So if you saw a decimal number like 1.01, I think the easiest way to think about this is in terms of a price. That would be like $1.01. The dollar is the whole number, and we know that a 1 cent is like, not that we really use pennies anymore, but it's one part of 100 that makes up that whole dollar. In fact, if we look at this image here, they're suggesting I should read the example. What decimal number is illustrated? This whole huge square, and there's 100 in there, it's 10 by 10, is representing the whole. So we are going to say this is 1/100th. And hopefully you remember in terms of your columns, we have the decimal, then there's no tenths, and then we have the hundredths, so 1/100ths. Again, this is that connection, and that's why I chose this number, between a dollar being the whole and made up of 100 little pieces. Another way, and I'm looking kind of further ahead here, we're going to make the connection between fractions and decimals, which is really important a little bit later. You could write this as 1/100th. Notice in terms of the way they're said, it's the same as well. 0 and 100th or 100th. And another connection we could say is whenever we think about a percent, it's always out of 100. So this illustrates 1%. It is 1 out of 100. But for now, we just need to do this decimal. So our whole is split into 100. So we put 1 in the hundredths column. So I just wrote that in here. We have 0 in the tenths, but we have 1 in the hundredths because there's 1 colored in out of 100 pieces. So our decimal answer would be decimal 0.1. This example has the same question, what decimal number is illustrated? But this time we notice the whole isn't split into 100 pieces. It's split into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tenths of a whole. So obviously we're going to put our number in the tenths column. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 filled in. So we're going to put 5 in the tenths. So we're going to write, it's always good practice to put a 0 in front of the decimal, unless we know there's some whole, but here it's just a part of a whole. 0 and 5/10. Again, that 5 is in the tenths column because there are 5 colored in out of 10. Bit of a connection. This would be written as 5/10 as a fraction. We could also write it as 50/100ths. We'll talk more about that later, which would be 50%. For now, though, all you need to know is this part here, and hopefully you're making the connection that this looks like a fraction image, and it can be represented in either of these two ways here. This example says again, what decimal number is illustrated? This time we see we have 2 whole shapes colored in, so we can write down here in our place value chart under the ones, which is 1 whole piece, we have 2 whole colored in. And then again, I'm noticing this shape is split into hundredths. So I'm going to say, how many do I have here? That's 10, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 24 hundredths. Now, this is a really important piece. If we're talking about hundredths, it has to end in the hundredths column. And the reason is, really, we've said there's 2 tenths and 4 hundredths because one of these rows would be 1/10. If you think back to that last picture example we saw with the tenths, it was 1 whole column. So there's 2 tenths here and 4 of these single cubes that are out of 100. Or you could say, hey, the whole thing's out of 100 and there's 24 colored in. Either way, it has to end in that hundredths column. If we wrote the 2 here and the 4 there, we would say it 24 thousandths. And that's not right because this isn't split into 1,000. It's split into 100. So 2 of the whole tenths, 4 hundredths, or you can think of it as 24 hundredths. and just again making that connection to the fractions, seeing how closely they're tied together. We could either write it in this decimal form as 2 and 24 hundredths, or we can write it as a mixed number or a mixed fraction, which you'll learn about a little later in the year. 2 whole and 24 out of 100, also read as 2 whole and 24 hundredths. Notice the similarity there, 2 whole, 24 hundredths, 2 whole and 24 hundredths. The connection is strong. This is the last example we're going to look at in this section, in this video rather. What decimal number is illustrated? So here I have 1, 2, 3 whole. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in my ones, 3 whole. And in terms of pieces here, I noticed first of all that it's split into 10 pieces. So I'm only going to be writing in the tenths column. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Obviously, it would have been faster to say, hey, what's 10 minus 2 is 8. So 8 in the tenths. So 3 whole and 8 tenths. Again, making that connection to the fractions. 3 whole, 8 tenths. And I think I hope that makes sense and it's pretty self-explanatory for you. Again, so I guess I should emphasize the fact that because it's tenths, I'm ending, it's a little more straightforward this one because it's only one digit, but it has to end in that tenths column. Really, it only began there as well. It's a single digit, but 8 in the tenths. If you put it anywhere else, it's a completely different thing. These are much smaller. Think about how small that hundredths, like little square was compared to one of these long tenths. So then when you think of a thousandth, it's going to be even tinier than the hundredth. And a 10,000th, I don't even know how small that is. But we're thinking about it in terms of parts. A connection I'm going to make here too, actually. I like to think about numbers, decimal numbers in particular, in terms of price. Notice this is very similar to $3.80. So Ms. Cooper, could I write a 0 in the hundredths? Is that going to make a difference? It's not changing the number. If we split, I can't do it all right here, but if I had what's that, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, is that 10? If I had it in all those little cubes, the same amount of the shape would be colored. We'd just be writing it in hundredths instead, and then I'd have 80 hundredths rather than 8 tenths. But they are the same thing. The same amount is colored in. We'll talk about this more later. But for now, you just need to know it's 3 and 8 tenths. And I'm telling you, it's the same as 3 and 80 hundredths. 3 and 800 thousandths. I could put as many zeros as I want. If I made these little squares tinier, I still would have this much space not colored in and this much colored in. Okay, good luck with this section.